There is a kind of silence that is not empty, but alive. It does not beg to be heard, nor does it rush to explain itself. It simply exists, steady, unshaken, and deeply aware of its own power. And strangely enough, it is this kind of silence that unsettles those who once felt in control of your reactions. Because when you stop responding the way they expect, something within them begins to shift. The room does not change, the words do not change, but the energy does. And in that quiet space, egos begin to lose their certainty, not because you have done something loud, but because you have chosen not to. Some people do not fear your anger, they fear your calm, because calm exposes what chaos used to hide. When you were reacting, explaining, defending yourself again and again, they felt in control of the story. Your emotions became the place where they could measure their power, because every reaction from you was proof that they still had access to your inner world. But the moment you step back into stillness, something changes that cannot be easily managed or manipulated. Your silence begins to speak in a language they were never prepared to understand. In that calm, there is no longer anything to fight against. There is no argument to twist, no emotion to provoke, no reaction to feed upon. And so what remains is the truth, unfiltered and unavoidable. They begin to sit with their own reflection, and it is not always a gentle sight, because your calm does not attack them, but it also does not rescue them anymore. It simply allows reality to take its place without interruption. And this is where the ego begins to feel uneasy. An ego is comfortable when it is being engaged, even if the engagement is conflict. But silence removes its stage. It removes the applause, the resistance, the emotional fuel it once depended on. Suddenly, what once felt like power begins to feel like emptiness. And in that emptiness, questions arise that cannot be answered with manipulation or noise. You are no longer participating in the emotional script they expected you to follow. You are no longer proving, defending, or trying to be understood by someone who only listened when it benefited them. And without your participation, their perception of control starts to fade, not because you took anything from them, but because you stopped giving your energy to what was never balanced in the first place. There is a quiet strength in this withdrawal that cannot be faked. It is not coldness and it is not revenge. It is clarity. It is the moment you realize that peace is not something you negotiate with people who thrive on confusion. And so you choose calm, not as a strategy, but as a boundary. And in that boundary, something profound happens. You begin to see that your silence was never about them losing you. It was about you returning to yourself. And for those who are only connected to your reactions, your calm feels like disappearance. But for you, it feels like freedom taking its first deep breath after being held for too long. When you stop explaining yourself, something quietly shifts in the space between you and those who were once used to your constant justification. At first, they do not understand it. They wait for you to continue the pattern, to clarify, to defend, to soften the edges of their assumptions, but the explanation never comes. And in that absence, a strange discomfort begins to rise, not in you, but in them, because explanation is often mistaken for obligation. When you once gave it freely, they learned, sometimes without realizing, that your voice would always return to fill the silence they created. They built confidence on that rhythm. They pushed, you responded. They doubted, you clarified. They withdrew, you reached. And in that cycle, they felt a sense of control, as if your words were something they could summon at will. But silence interrupts that pattern in a way nothing else can. It does not argue, it does not resist. It simply refuses to participate. And in that refusal, the structure they depended on begins to weaken. There is no longer a reply to measure against, no emotional reaction to shape their narrative around, no explanation to dissect or reinterpret. Your absence from that exchange becomes its own kind of statement, one they cannot easily answer. The ego, in its nature, depends on recognition. It feeds on being acknowledged, even in disagreement. But when you withdraw the need to be understood by those committed to misunderstanding you, you step outside of that system entirely. And once you are no longer participating, their control loses its reference point. It is not that they suddenly lose power over you. It is that the illusion of power no longer has anything to attach itself to. This is where discomfort grows, not because you have done something aggressive, but because you have stopped offering access. And access was what sustained the dynamic. Without your explanations, they are left alone with their interpretations, and interpretations without your correction begin to reveal their own instability. There is a quiet reversal in this moment. What once required your effort to maintain is now sustained only by their expectation. And expectations, when unmet, slowly turn inward. They begin to question why the usual response is missing, why the familiar emotional engagement has stopped arriving. In that questioning, something fragile begins to surface, the realization that your voice is no longer available for negotiation. And while they search for the version of you that used to explain everything away, you are no longer standing in that place. You have stepped into a stillness that does not require permission, validation, or repetition. And in that stillness, their need for control quietly dissolves. Not because you fought it, but because you stopped feeding it. Silence becomes a mirror, and not everyone is brave enough to look at who they truly are. There is something unsettling about being left alone with your own reflection when there is no longer anyone else shaping the image for you. When you were present in conversation, in reaction, in emotional exchange, there was always a kind of distraction available. Someone else to blame, someone else to interpret, someone else to respond to. But silence removes all of that interference. It does not add anything new. It simply reveals what was already there, waiting beneath the noise. And in that quiet reflection, people begin to see what they were able to avoid when your voice was still part of the dialogue. They see the tone they used when they thought you would always respond. They see the assumptions that were spoken with confidence but never questioned. They see the moments where control mattered more than understanding. And most importantly, they see how much of their certainty depended on your participation in their version of reality. This is where silence becomes uncomfortable, not because it is cruel, but because it is honest. It does not distort, it does not soften, and it does not negotiate. It simply reflects. And reflection is not always something the ego welcomes, because the ego prefers versions of truth that feel manageable. It prefers stories where it remains justified, where it remains right, where it remains untouched by doubt. But silence offers no such comfort. It does not argue against the ego, nor does it support it. It simply stands still long enough for awareness to catch up with reality. And in that stillness, what was once projected outward begins to return inward. The words that were once directed at you now echo differently when there is no response to carry them further. There is a moment in this process where avoidance is no longer possible, when distraction no longer works, when the absence of your reaction becomes louder than your presence ever was. And in that moment, the mirror does its quiet work. It shows what has been difficult to admit, not because it is loud or harsh, but because it is uninterrupted. Not everyone is prepared for that kind of honesty. Some will turn away quickly, looking for noise again, seeking anything that restores the comfort of external focus. But others will stay in that stillness just long enough to feel the weight of what they have avoided. And for them, silence becomes more than absence. It becomes awareness. And while they stand in front of that reflection, you are no longer responsible for shaping what they see. You are no longer adjusting yourself to soften the edges of their perception. You are no longer holding up a version of yourself that makes their discomfort easier to avoid. Instead, you remain in your own stillness, where silence is no longer a mirror for them alone, but a return to yourself, unfiltered and finally uninterrupted. The more you withdraw your energy, the more their need for validation becomes painfully visible. There is a subtle shift that happens when you stop pouring yourself into places that never truly held you with care. At first, the absence of your energy is not understood as absence at all. It is mistaken for distance that will eventually return, for silence that will eventually break, for attention that will eventually resume its old rhythm. But when it does not return, something begins to surface that was previously hidden beneath your presence. Because your energy, in ways you may not have been fully aware of, was part of the structure that held certain dynamics together. It was the reassurance in your replies, the patience in your listening, the emotional availability that softened the edges of conflict. And when that begins to fade, the imbalance that was once quietly sustained becomes visible in ways that can no longer be ignored. People often do not notice the value of what they are receiving until the flow of it changes. When you were constantly present, your energy became something assumed rather than appreciated. But assumption is fragile. It depends entirely on continuity, and the moment continuity is broken, the space it leaves behind does not remain empty for long. It begins to reveal what was always underneath it. That is where need becomes visible, not the kind of need that is expressed with honesty and humility, but the kind that surfaces through discomfort, through repeated attempts to re-engage what is no longer freely given, through the subtle shift in tone when silence is not answered, through the growing realization that what once responded without hesitation is no longer accessible in the same way. And in that realization, something uncomfortable arises. Because when your energy was present, it allowed certain patterns to remain unexamined. It allowed imbalance to feel like normality. It allowed one-sided emotional exchange to continue without question. But now, with your withdrawal, those patterns are no longer covered. They are exposed in their raw form. This exposure is not something you create with intention. It is something that happens naturally when your presence is no longer available to absorb what was never reciprocated. And in that absence, people are forced to confront the difference between genuine connection and emotional convenience, between mutual exchange and silent dependence. There is a kind of clarity that comes from this moment, but it is not always comfortable for everyone involved. Because clarity does not flatter ego, it does not maintain illusions. It simply shows what is left when your energy is no longer filling the gaps, and what remains can be difficult to ignore. The attempts to regain your attention become more noticeable. The shifts in behavior become more pronounced. The need for your response becomes less subtle and more direct. Not because you have changed who you are, but because you have stopped overextending who you were for the sake of balance that never truly existed. In your withdrawal, you do not take anything away. You simply stop adding what was never being matched. And in that space, everything becomes visible, especially the difference between those who valued your presence and those who only became aware of it when it began to disappear. Ego survives on reaction. When you stop reacting, you quietly dismantle its throne. There is a hidden economy in emotional exchange that most people never notice while they are inside it. Attention is currency, reaction is fuel, and control is often maintained not through strength, but through stimulation. When someone knows they can provoke you, disturb you, or pull you into defending yourself, they are no longer just speaking to you, they are shaping your responses. And in that shaping, they begin to feel a sense of authority, even if it is subtle and unspoken. But silence interrupts this entire system. When you no longer react, you are no longer participating in the transaction that kept the dynamic alive. The throne of ego is not built on truth. It is built on engagement. It depends on being acknowledged in order to feel real. And when acknowledgement stops arriving in the form it expects, anger, explanation, resistance, emotional overflow, it begins to lose its stability. At first, the absence of reaction is misread. It is assumed to be temporary or strategic or even emotional suppression that will eventually break. The ego often cannot imagine a state where it is no longer being answered in the language it understands. So it continues to test, to provoke, to reach for the familiar response patterns that once confirmed its influence. But silence does not negotiate with those attempts. It does not rise to meet them. It does not descend into the same emotional ground. And in that refusal, something begins to shift. The energy that once circled between action and reaction starts to dissolve. Without reaction, provocation loses its meaning. Without emotional return, control loses its grip. What remains is effort without reward, intention without echo, and expectation without fulfillment. This is where the dismantling happens quietly, not in confrontation, but in non-participation. The throne does not collapse dramatically, it simply stops being reinforced. Each moment you choose not to react is another layer removed from its foundation, and over time, what once felt powerful begins to feel unsteady because it is no longer being held up by your attention. There is a deeper transformation within you as well. The space that was once occupied by reaction slowly becomes available again. You begin to notice that not every stimulus requires a response, not every opinion deserves emotional investment, not every provocation needs to be met with presence. In that realization, silence is no longer something you use as a tactic, it becomes a form of clarity, and clarity changes the relationship entirely. You are no longer inside the cycle that measures your worth through reaction. You are no longer pulled into proving, correcting, or defending your position against noise that feeds on engagement. Instead, you observe the pattern for what it is, a structure that only exists when you participate in it. When you stop reacting, you are not losing power. You are withdrawing it from systems that depended on your unconscious contribution. And in that withdrawal, the throne of ego does not fall with noise or resistance. It simply stops being supported until one day it is no longer standing at all, because the silence around it finally became stronger than the reaction that once kept it alive. Your absence in argument is not weakness. It is the moment their importance starts to shrink. There is a misunderstanding that silence means surrender, as if stepping back from conflict is the same as losing it, but not every battle is worth the breath it consumes, and not every voice raised against you deserves a response that gives it more life. When you choose not to argue, you are not disappearing. You are withdrawing permission for something to continue that no longer deserves your participation. Arguments often thrive on attention, not truth. They grow stronger when two people keep feeding them with emotion, urgency, and the need to be right. But the moment you remove yourself from that exchange, something shifts in the balance. The words that were meant to provoke no longer have a surface to land on. They fall into silence where they cannot multiply, cannot escalate, and cannot shape your emotional state. In that absence, what once felt powerful begins to lose its structure, because importance in many human interactions is not inherent, it is reinforced. When you engage, you reinforce. When you respond with intensity, you reinforce again. But when you step away, that reinforcement stops. And without it, the weight of the other person's stance begins to reduce, not because you have attacked it, but because you have stopped sustaining it. This is where the shift becomes visible to those who are paying attention. They expect resistance, because resistance confirms relevance. They expect emotion, because emotion confirms access. But what they meet instead is space, unfilled, unclaimed, unresponsive. And in that space, their certainty begins to echo differently. What once sounded like authority starts to sound like assumption. What once felt like control starts to feel like effort, without impact. Your absence in argument creates a quiet separation between what is real and what was being projected. It removes the emotional support that inflated certain dynamics beyond their natural size. And without that support, things return to their actual proportions. Not because you reduced them, but because you stopped enlarging them through reaction. There is also something deeply grounding that happens within you in that moment. The urge to defend slowly loses its urgency. The need to be understood in every interaction begins to soften. You start to recognize that clarity does not always require participation, and peace does not always require explanation. Some things resolve not through engagement, but through refusal to continue engaging. And so your silence in the argument is not emptiness, it is definition. It defines what you will no longer give energy to. It defines what no longer has access to your emotional center. It defines the boundary between being involved and being available for disruption. Over time, what once felt like a necessity, the need to respond, to correct, to prove, begins to dissolve, and in its place is a steadier awareness that not every voice deserves your reaction, and not every conflict deserves your presence. In that awareness, your absence is no longer something that needs justification. It simply becomes the space where your importance is no longer negotiated by those who only understood it when you stopped participating. Silence forces truth to breathe, and truth is something fragile egos cannot survive for long. There is a quiet but undeniable power in what is left unsaid. When words are removed from a situation that was once filled with constant justification, something else begins to emerge. Not interpretation, not defense, not performance, but truth in its simplest form, unpolished and unprotected. In conversation, truth is often shaped by emotion. It is stretched, softened, or sharpened, depending on what someone wants to win or avoid. But silence does not participate in that shaping. It does not adjust itself to comfort anyone's pride. It simply clears the space, and in that cleared space, truth is no longer competing with noise. It begins to stand on its own without distortion. And for an ego that is used to being protected by constant response, this is where discomfort begins. Because ego does not only depend on being right, it depends on being reinforced. It depends on feedback that confirms its version of reality, even if that feedback is emotional resistance or argument. But when silence replaces response, that reinforcement disappears. What remains is raw reality, no longer filtered through reaction. In that stillness, things become harder to avoid. Words that were once spoken in confidence are now left without echo. Assumptions that once felt stable begin to feel uncertain when they are not being challenged or validated. And slowly, what was being projected outward begins to turn inward, where it cannot be redirected as easily. This is why silence can feel so unsettling to those who relied on emotional engagement. It does not attack them, but it also does not protect them from themselves. It allows every thought, every intention, every unspoken truth to exist without interruption. And in that uninterrupted space, clarity begins to form, whether it is welcomed or not. Truth does not need volume to exist. It only needs space. And silence creates that space without interference. It removes the constant need to respond, to justify, to reshape perception. It allows things to be seen as they are, not as they are defended to be. And in that seeing, illusions begin to lose their stability. For someone who has built their sense of control on reaction, this can feel like a quiet unraveling. Not because anything is being taken away, but because nothing is being added anymore to sustain what was never fully grounded. The absence of your voice becomes a kind of exposure, not of you, but of what remains when your participation is no longer available to hold things in place. And yet, within this process, there is also a shift that belongs to you. Because silence is not only something that reveals others, it also refines you. It removes your need to explain what is already becoming clear. It dissolves the urgency to be understood by those who only understood you through reaction. It teaches you that truth does not require constant defense to remain true. So when silence forces truth to breathe, it is not a harsh act. It is a clearing, and in that clearing, what cannot exist without noise begins to fade, while what is real begins to stand quietly on its own, without effort, without performance, and without permission. When you no longer chase closure, something quiet but irreversible happens within the emotional landscape you once felt tied to. The need to complete every conversation, to resolve every misunderstanding, to gather every missing explanation, slowly begins to lose its authority over you. There was a time when unfinished words felt like open wounds, as if silence itself was an incomplete sentence demanding your return. You tried to stitch meaning into places where others had already walked away, believing that if you just spoke one more time, clarity would finally arrive. But closure, when it is forced, rarely becomes truth. It becomes performance dressed as resolution. And so, when you stop chasing it, the pattern breaks. What once depended on your persistence no longer has a pathway back into your energy. The conversations that were designed to loop endlessly lose their direction. The emotional threads that kept pulling you into explanation begin to loosen. Not because answers suddenly appeared, but because your need to retrieve them quietly dissolved. And in that dissolution, something unexpected begins to unfold. The unfinished power games remain suspended in the air, but without your participation, they lose their momentum. Power games rely on return of emotion, return of attention, return of pursuit. When that return stops happening, they are left in an uncomfortable stillness where the script no longer continues. The other person may still expect a reaction, a final word, a sign that the cycle is still alive, but what they meet instead is absence, not hostility, not resistance, just absence that refuses to complete what was never balanced to begin with. In that absence, the ego begins to lose its orientation. It searches for the familiar rhythm of engagement, the push and pull that once defined its sense of importance. But when that rhythm no longer answers back, it begins to feel like standing in a room where the echo has disappeared. What remains is not victory or defeat, but uncertainty, an unfamiliar silence where control used to feel alive. And within you, something entirely different begins to take shape. The absence of closure no longer feels like loss. It begins to feel like release. You stop interpreting silence as something unfinished and start recognizing it as something complete in its own way. You no longer measure peace by whether others have understood you, but by whether you are still willing to enter spaces that require you to shrink your clarity just to maintain connection. This shift changes everything quietly. You are no longer walking back into emotional loops that depend on your explanation. You are no longer reaching for endings that were never designed to honor your presence. Instead, you begin to recognize that some stories do not end with understanding. They end with withdrawal. And for those who once depended on your engagement, this withdrawal becomes its own kind of weight, not because you have created harm, but because the structure that required your reaction is no longer functioning. They are left with the unfinished shape of something they expected you to complete while you remain outside of it, no longer participating in its continuation. In the end, silence becomes the final form of closure you no longer chase. Not because everything is resolved, but because nothing unresolved is powerful enough to pull you back into cycles that were never designed for your peace. And in that quiet refusal, you are no longer seeking the ending. You have already stepped beyond its need to exist at all. In your silence, you are not lost. You are becoming unreachable to those who once fed on your emotional noise. There is a misunderstanding that when someone stops reacting, stops explaining, stops returning to old emotional patterns, they have somehow faded or disappeared. But silence is not disappearance. It is relocation. It is the moment you step out of a space where your emotions were once easily accessed, easily triggered, and often misunderstood as availability rather than vulnerability. There are people who grow accustomed to your reactions the way others grow accustomed to a rhythm. They learn your responses, your tone, your emotional entry points. Over time, without realizing it, they begin to depend not on your presence alone, but on your predictable emotional movement. That movement becomes the evidence they use to measure your engagement, your attention, your investment in the connection. But when that rhythm stops, what they are left with is not emptiness, it is unfamiliarity. And unfamiliarity is where ego begins to lose its comfort, because ego prefers patterns it can recognize, even if those patterns are unstable. It prefers emotional noise it can interpret, even if that noise is conflict. But silence cannot be interpreted in the same way. It does not offer clues to manipulate. It does not provide emotional feedback to adjust against. It simply exists outside of reach, no longer participating in the dynamic that once defined it. This is where your silence becomes a form of distance that is not physical, but emotional and energetic. You are still present in your own life, but no longer available in the way you once were for people who relied on your emotional openness as a space they could enter without effort. And when that access is no longer granted, what they experience is not just your absence, it is the loss of influence they did not realize they had.